The envelope sat in my coat pocket for 11 days before I opened it. It had been sitting there since the funeral, tucked under my scarf in the inside pocket, and every morning when I put on my coat, I could feel the edge of it pressing against my ribs, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. My grandmother had passed in February, the coldest February anyone in Sudbury could remember. The kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside. She'd been sick for a while, long enough that her death wasn't a shock exactly, but grief doesn't care about timelines. She was my person. She'd been my person since I was 7 years old and my parents split and everything fell apart. And she was the one who showed up at my school with hot chocolate in a thermos and said, without dramatics, "Come stay with me for a while." I stayed for 4 years. Her name was June. Not short for anything. Just June, like the month, which she said her mother had chosen because she came into the world on the 21st, the longest day of the year. She was a woman who filled up a room without raising her voice. She taught piano for 40 years out of the house on Larch Street. She made butter tarts from scratch every Christmas, and she kept a garden that should not have survived the Sudbury climate but somehow always did. When she died, she left behind a house full of sheet music and ceramic roosters and a filing cabinet that nobody wanted to deal with, and one envelope, handwritten, addressed to me. My stepmother was the one who found it. She'd been sorting through the things in my grandmother's bedroom. Not because anyone asked her to, but because that's what my stepmother does. She positions herself at the center of every situation that doesn't involve her. She'd driven up from Toronto the day after the funeral with 2 large rolling suitcases, and by the time I arrived from my apartment across town, she was already reorganizing the kitchen. Her name is Sandra. She has been with my father for 14 years. She has never once made butter tarts. She handed me the envelope with 2 fingers, like it was slightly damp. "Found this in the nightstand," she said. "Addressed to you, so." She let the sentence trail off the way she always does, like the completion of a thought was beneath her. I took it and didn't open it. I don't know why. Maybe because Sandra was watching me with that particular expression she gets, the one that's performing disinterest while absorbing every detail. I put it in my coat pocket and I left. That was the first date of February. I opened it on the 12th. My father called it a birthday card. He hadn't seen it. He didn't know what was inside. But when I mentioned at dinner one night that Grandma had left me a letter, that's what he said. "Probably a birthday card. She always sent you birthday cards." I didn't respond to that. My father has a habit of naming things before he understands them. It makes him feel in control. Inside the envelope was a key and a letter, 4 pages, written in my grandmother's handwriting, the careful slanted cursive of someone who'd spent decades marking piano sheet music. Arrows and crescendos and little stars next to passages she wanted students to repeat. The letter told me about a safety deposit box at the TD branch on Durham Street, which she'd held since 1987. It told me the box was in both our names, hers and mine, and had been since I turned 18. She'd added me quietly, without telling anyone, without ceremony, because, she wrote, I didn't want it to become a conversation. She knew her son. She knew how conversations with my father became negotiations. The letter told me that the box contained documents, her will, the real one, not the summary the lawyer had read at the family meeting, property records, and something else, a registered account statement that she'd been updating every year and leaving in the box for safekeeping. "I never trusted the mail," she wrote, "and I never trusted your father with numbers." She wasn't wrong about either of those things. I want to explain something about my father before I go further, because I think it matters. My father is not a cruel man in the way you might picture. He doesn't yell. He doesn't storm around or slam doors. He operates more quietly than that. He is the kind of person who makes you feel, very gradually, like your perceptions are slightly off. Like you're always a little bit misremembering. Like the ground is not quite where you thought it was. When I was 12, I told him that Sandra had said something unkind to me at a family dinner. I don't even remember what it was now, something about my hair or my grades or both. And he looked at me with this patient expression and said, I think you might have misunderstood her. She was trying to help." And then he changed the subject. He did that for years. Misunderstood, misremembered, overreacted. By the time I was 20, I'd stopped telling him things. By 25, I'd moved back to Sudbury, partly because I needed to be near my grandmother, and partly because I needed to be 5 hours away from him. He moved back too the year after. Said he missed the north. Sandra said the traffic in Toronto was killing her. They bought a house 20 minutes from mine and called it a fresh start. I was 31 when my grandmother died. I'd spent the better part of 2 decades finding my footing, and I was finally stable. I had a job I was good at, a home I'd made carefully, a partner who knew all my family stories and loved me anyway. His name is Marcus. He works in building inspection. He is the least dramatic person I have ever met, which is either the luckiest thing that ever happened to me or a very elaborate balancing act by the universe. When I told Marcus about the envelope, he said, "What do you want to do?" That's what he always says. Not what do you think it means or what do you think your dad will do. Just, what do you want to do? I said, I want to go to the bank. The TD on Durham Street is a 10-minute walk from my apartment. I went on a Thursday morning in the middle of February, before work, in the kind of cold that makes everything feel slightly unreal. I had the key and the letter and my ID and my grandmother's death certificate, which the lawyer had sent me a copy of. The woman at the front desk looked at the death certificate the way you look at something you've seen 100 times but still feel the weight of. She was kind about it. She brought me to a small room off the main floor, the kind with a single table and a privacy door, and she went and got the box herself. It was a standard metal safety deposit box, the long, narrow kind. She set it on the table, confirmed my identity, and left me alone. I sat with it closed for a minute. Then I opened it. There were 4 folders inside, labeled in my grandmother's handwriting. House, Larch Street. Will, full copy. Insurance, and the 4th one, which just said my name. I opened mine last. Inside was a single-page account statement, printed on plain paper. At the top, it said Registered Retirement Savings Plan, Beneficiary Designation. Her RRSP, she'd had it since 1984. She'd named me the sole beneficiary, not my father, not my uncle who lived in BC, not Sandra, not anyone. Me. I looked at the total balance. The number was $340,000. I read it 3 times. Then I looked at the transaction history, which went back years. The deposits, modest at first, then more substantial after she sold a piece of property in the 90s. Then growing quietly from that point on through a mix of GICs and low-risk mutual funds that a woman in her 70s had evidently researched more carefully than most people research anything. There was also a handwritten note clipped to the statement. This is yours. It always was. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The advisor's number is below. Call her. She knows you're coming. Her name was the advisor. Not mine to give, but she picked up on the second ring when I called from the parking lot. And she said, I was wondering when you'd call. Your grandmother spoke about you all the time. I didn't tell my father right away. I told Marcus that night, and he sat across from me at the kitchen table while I talked. And he said when I was done, how do you feel? I said I didn't know yet. I think what I actually felt was something like vertigo, the sense of the ground shifting. My grandmother had done this quietly over decades, without fanfare, without ever making me feel like I owed her anything. She'd just built something and put my name on it and waited. 40 years of patience compressed into a single manila folder. I thought about the piano lessons she'd given for $1 less than her competitors, because she wanted kids whose parents couldn't quite afford it to still be able to come. I thought about the greenhouse in the backyard where she started seeds in February because, she said, you have to believe in spring before there's any evidence of it. I thought about the way she used to say my name when I called her. Not just my name, but the particular warmth in it, like she'd been waiting to hear from me specifically. I cried in the parking lot of the TD on Durham Street, and I didn't care who saw. My father found out on a Saturday, not from me. From my uncle, who'd gotten a copy of the full will from the lawyer, and had called my father, presumably to process the whole thing, and in the course of that conversation had mentioned that the RRSP had gone directly to me. My father called me at 8 in the morning. Sandra called 17 minutes later when I didn't answer. Then my father called again. I picked up the second time. He said very calmly, "I think we need to talk about the estate." I said, "Okay." He said, "Your grandmother's RRSP. I think there may have been a misunderstanding about the beneficiary." I want you to notice the word he chose, misunderstanding. After 31 years, you'd think I'd be less struck by it. But something about hearing it in this particular context, in this particular conversation, about something my grandmother had arranged deliberately, carefully, over 40 years, made my chest go very still and quiet. I said, "There's no misunderstanding. She designated me 20 years ago." He said she was getting older. She may not have remembered exactly what she'd set up. These things happen. I said, "She left me a letter. She knew exactly what she'd set up." He paused. Then, with the patience of a man who has never once believed he was in the wrong, "I'm not saying she didn't care about you. I'm saying she may not have been thinking clearly about the implications for the family." The family. When my father says the family, he means himself. I said, "I have to go." He said, "Sandra and I would like to sit down with you this week, just to talk." I called the RRSP advisor the next morning and asked her to explain, very precisely, what the legal status was. She was patient and clear. Registered accounts with named beneficiaries pass outside the estate entirely. The money didn't go through probate. It didn't go through the executor. It came to me directly, by operation of law, because my grandmother had put my name there and signed the form, and that was that. There was no misunderstanding to correct. There was no implication to reconsider. There was no sitting down. I called a lawyer anyway, just to confirm, just because I wanted to hear it from someone with letters after their name. He said the same thing, with slightly more technical language. He also noted, not unkindly, that if anyone made claims of undue influence or incapacity against the beneficiary designation, they would need to produce evidence. And the threshold was significant, he said. "It sounds like your grandmother was very deliberate," I said. "She always was." The sit-down happened anyway, not because I agreed to it. I hadn't, but because my father and Sandra showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening with a bottle of wine and the energy of people who believe that physical presence is a form of argument. Marcus answered the door. He looked at them, looked back at me, and said very neutrally, "You've got company." We sat in the living room. My father had a way of making my furniture feel like props. He sat in the armchair across from me and put the wine on the coffee table, uncorked, like it was a peace offering, and then he talked for 20 minutes about family and legacy and what my grandmother would have wanted. He said, she would have wanted this handled fairly. Sandra nodded at everything he said. She has a specific nod. Small, controlled, like she's conducting him. I let him finish. Then I said, "She wrote me a letter. 4 pages. She told me what she wanted. She named me the beneficiary 20 years ago and updated the designation twice after that. I have the documents and I've spoken to a lawyer. There's nothing to discuss." My father looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You've spoken to a lawyer?" "Yes, without telling me." "I didn't realize I needed your permission." Sandra uncrossed and recrossed her ankles. My father set down his wine glass with the precise care of someone managing an expression. He said, "I'm your father." I said, "I know, and she was my mother. I know that too. And you don't think that entitles me to?" "No," I said, "I don't." The room went quiet, not uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that's actually clarity. My father started to say something else. Marcus, from the kitchen doorway where he'd been standing the whole time, said, "I think the conversation's done." Not loudly, not aggressively, just a statement of fact in the same tone he uses when he's calling something on a building inspection. "This doesn't pass. Move on." My father left 20 minutes later. He kissed me on the cheek at the door, which surprised me. Sandra didn't. I didn't hear from him for 3 weeks after that. When he did call, it was a Sunday morning, and he said he'd been thinking, and he wanted me to know that he respected my grandmother's wishes. I said, "Okay." He said, "I hope we can move past this." I said, "I do too." We have not moved past it exactly, but we have arrived at something that functions like a truce. He comes for dinner occasionally. Sandra comes with him. We talk about the weather and local news and the state of the roads in February, which in Sudbury is genuinely worth discussing. I don't know if what we have is what other people would call a relationship, but it's what we have. I didn't spend the money right away. I sat with it for 4 months, which is apparently unusual, because the advisor mentioned it gently in the spring when she called to check in. I told her I was taking my time. She said, "That's exactly what your grandmother said you'd do." What I eventually did with it was practical, in ways that would probably seem boring from the outside. I used part of it to pay off the remaining mortgage on my apartment. Not all of it, but enough to make the rest manageable. I set some aside in a TFSA and let it grow because my grandmother's letter had mentioned specifically that she'd always wished she'd started a tax-free savings account earlier, before they existed, and she would have been pleased to know I'd done it. I kept a portion liquid for a while, just to feel like I could breathe, and I used some of it to have the upright piano in my grandmother's living room properly restored. I'd inherited it with the house. The house was being sold, eventually, to cover the estate costs, but the piano was mine specifically, mentioned by name in the will. And it had been sitting out of tune for 3 years because she'd had trouble hearing in her last years and couldn't tell. I had a technician come in, someone who drove up from Barrie, who spent 6 hours on it, and when he was done, played a scale and looked at the ceiling and said, "She's good." I sat down and played the first piece my grandmother ever taught me. I was 7 years old when I learned it. I still remembered every note. I don't know how to explain what that felt like, except to say that the room felt occupied again in the best possible way. Like something that had been very quiet for a while had decided to speak. She gave me that, too. All those years ago, on the longest day of the year, she'd put my name on something before I even knew I needed it. That's who she was. And I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful that she was mine.